As it seems lately as a daily occurrence, we have new developments in the Russia probe. President Trump today saying he just personally finished writing answers to questions provided by Bob Mueller, but he has yet to submit them. That as there are new questions about Trump's appointment of acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker. A slew of top Republicans, they are pushing Trump, we hear, to appoint a permanent replacement for Whitaker because that will blunt concerns about meddling in the probe. Of course, Whitaker is an opponent of such an idea, and he has also called the whole probe a witch hunt. There are also ongoing suggestions about whether or not his appointment itself was above board. So for more, let's bring in our guest, David Rudenstein. He's professor of constitutional law at Cardozo Law School. He was the dean of that law school from 2001 to 2009. He's also the author of The Age of Deference, the Supreme Court, National Security, and the Constitutional Order. David, thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I have a host of specific questions, but a more broad one. I'm not trying to date you here, but you've been teaching constitutional law for nearly 40 years. I'm curious, in the class conversations, have you had a moment in American governance where we are closer to a constitutional crisis than we are now?
Well, I wasn't in the classroom during the Nixon-Watergate era, but I think it would be very hard to figure out which of the two of these moments is more serious, and it doesn't really particularly matter. They both present a really direct challenge to the democratic process and to the rule of law.
To that end, is the appointment of Whitaker even constitutional by bypassing Rosenstein and the way this is done, obviously with no confirmation process in between? How does the Constitution look at this, and more broadly, where would the checks and balances be?
You know, the Constitution was set up so that people who occupied a high office within the executive branch had to pass muster with the United States Senate. That hasn't happened here, and as a result, some serious questions have been raised as to whether or not the appointment is at all constitutional, because he hasn't appeared before the Senate. There's been no advice, and there certainly hasn't been any consent.
What about the vacancy clause, which some people say could be an end round here, where the president could appoint, albeit on a temporary basis, I think, 70 days or whatever that it would allow for, and he or she, in this case he with Whitaker, would theoretically under that permutation be able to enjoy the full authority of an AG for, albeit a temporary window?
Yes, well, you know, that's a very complicated problem because there is a statute which is relevant that allows the president to make appointments on a temporary basis when a high-level office is vacated. In this particular case, that statute conflicts with a more specific statute that applies to the Department of Justice, and they're inconsistent with each other as to who should run the Department of Justice when the Attorney General steps down. So in this case, the President is acting under the more general statute, not under the specific statute. If he was acting under the specific statute, Rosenstein would be the acting Attorney General and not Whitaker. But then there's a second problem with this, with the current statute. The statute that the President is relying upon applies when somebody resigns or dies or is incapable of performing their responsibilities. In this case, there's been effectively a constructive termination. So we have a complicated statutory regime here, and I think the President is on thin ice.
Well, whether or not, I guess depending on a person's perspective, these are interesting, disturbing, or even bizarre times, they're certainly not dull. David, thank you very much for trying to make sense out of the senselessness. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me.
Coming up next, we head over to Broadway. Harvey Fierstein's Torch Song Trilogy, it's back on Broadway, and John Simon just saw it. As we know, John's incredibly tough to please. Did he like this version? His review straight ahead.